Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Welcome. Today, we're setting out on a really compelling journey. We're going right back to the very first traces of human presence in the Japanese archipelago.
Yeah, we'll be exploring how early people first got here, how they managed to adapt to, a constantly changing environment.
And the foundations they laid really for all the cultures that came later. Think of it like opening the very first pages of Japan's incredibly long and frankly fascinating story.
Exactly.
Right.
And we'll be looking at clues from, geology, the Earth itself, and archaeology, the things people left behind. Try and piece together this deep history of the islands and the very first people who called them home.
It's a huge story, isn't it? Spanning millions of years with some really dramatic environmental shifts.
Absolutely.
So maybe the best place to start is with the land itself. To understand how humans even arrived, we need to know how the Japanese islands actually formed, right?
That's a perfect starting point. You have to picture that way back during the Pliocene and Pleistocene epochs. That's a huge stretch, like 5 million down to about 10,000 years ago. Japan wasn't islands like today.
Not islands. So what was it?
It was basically connected to the Asian continent. Think of it as the eastern edge of Asia. And this whole vast period saw massive climate swings, especially these repeated ice ages.
Ah, the ice ages. I imagine they completely changed the landscape.
Totally. These cycles, glacial and interglacial periods, had a huge effect. During the really cold times, the glacial periods, so much water got locked up in ice sheets.
That sea levels dropped.
Exactly. They plummeted, sometimes by 100, maybe even 200 meters lower than today.
Whoa.
And that drop exposed land bridges, essentially, connecting Japan to the mainland where the straits are now, Soya, Suguru, Tsushima.
So you could actually walk from mainland Asia to what's now Japan. That's kind of mind-blowing.
At certain times, yes. But then, of course, the opposite happened.
The ice melted.
Right. As the last big glacial period ended, maybe around 10,000 years ago, the climate warmed up significantly. Ice sheets melted, sea levels rose back up.
Merging the land bridges.
Precisely. And that's when the straits formed, separating the archipelago from the continent. Geologically, we call this the start of the Holocene epoch.
It's incredible to think of that changing geography as the stage for life arriving. Speaking of life, when do we see the earliest signs of human ancestors, just in the bigger picture?
Well, if we zoom way out, you have early examples like Australopithecus africanus, found in South Africa, originally thought to be maybe 1 million years old.
Right.
But then later, Ardipithecus ramidus was found in Ethiopia, pushing things back much further, maybe around 5 million years ago.
And the big deal with Ardipithecus ramidus was watching upright, wasn't it? Bipedalism.
That's the key inference, yeah. We don't have complete leg bones, but the position of the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull where the spine connects, strongly suggests it was capable of walking upright on 2 legs, a really crucial step in hominid evolution.
Okay, so that sets the very early scene. Now, back to Japan. With these land bridges existing at times, when did actual humans start showing up there?
Well, humans likely arrived during the Pleistocene, using those land connections when sea levels were low.
Following animals, perhaps.
Very likely following migrations of large animals, megafauna from the continent. We have fossil proof, like Nalman's elephant remains found across Japan, showing these big creatures were definitely here during the Ice Age.
Megafauna, right? Just means big animals.
Exactly. Like elephants, giant deer.
So if the big animals crossed, it makes sense humans might have followed their food source. When do we find the first concrete evidence of humans themselves in Japan?
We do have fossil evidence of early Homo sapiens. There are the Hamakita remains from Shizuoka Prefecture and the Minotogawa remains from Okinawa.
Okay.
What's interesting, though, is that these particular fossils, so far, haven't been found directly associated with any tools.
No tools with them. And then there's the Akashi man. Sounds intriguing.
Ah, yes, the Akashi remains. Found back in 1931 in Hyogo Prefecture.
Yeah.
Initially, they were thought to be Pithecanthropus of a very early, sort of archaic human type.
But that changed.
Yes. Later research suggests they're more likely Homo sapiens, and maybe even from the Holocene, after the last big ice age.
A big shift in thinking. And the original fossil, it's gone, right?
Tragically, yes. Lost during wartime air raids. But luckily, a plaster cast had been made.
Ah, good.
So analysis of that cast, plus more investigation of the site, led to this revised understanding. There's even a chance they could be more recent, maybe Joemon or even later.
It just shows how our picture of the past keeps evolving with new finds and techniques. Now, fossils are one thing, but tools. Tools really signal human activity, don't they? Which brings us to the Paleolithic in Japan.
Absolutely. The game changer was 1949, the discovery at the Iwajuku site in Gunma Prefecture. They found chipped stone tools
Chipped stone tools. And where exactly?
in the Kanto loam layer. It's a distinctive reddish clay layer dating back to the late Pleistocene.
And why was Iwajuku so important? What did it change?
Well, before Iwajuku, the standard view in Japanese archaeology was basically no humans here during the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age.
Really?
Yeah. So this discovery was the first hard proof of a Paleolithic culture in Japan, one that existed before pottery during the Ice Age. It completely rewrote the early history books.
Wow, so it kicked off more searching.
Exactly. It spurred a whole wave of research, and since then, numerous other Paleolithic sites with similar chipped tools have been found all over the country.
So what were these tools like? What were they using them for?
The earliest ones were pretty basic, often oval-shaped like hand axes, versatile things for striking, chopping, maybe preparing food.
Okay.
But over time, they got more sophisticated. You see the development of knife-shaped tools, blades, much better for cutting.
More specialized.
Right. And then pointed tools, specifically spearheads for hunting. A clear progression.
And it didn't stop there.
No, later in the Paleolithic, you get microliths. These are tiny, finely made blades, often from materials like obsidian, that's volcanic glass.
Tiny blades. What for?
They weren't used alone. They were set into handles of wood or bone to make composite tools. Think knives, maybe sickles, or even tips for arrows or darts.
Ah, clever. Combining materials.
Yeah. And this whole evolution in tool technology in Japan, it mirrors what was happening in Paleolithic cultures elsewhere in the world.
And where do we usually find these Paleolithic sites? Does the location tell us anything about their lifestyle?
Often they're found on hilltops, places with a good view of the surroundings.
A strategic advantage.
Seems likely. It strongly suggests a nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Small groups moving around, following game, finding resources.
Which leads to the big question, who were these people and how do they connect to people in Japan today?
The general consensus points to Mongoloid origins for the Japanese people. That's a broad grouping across Asia. A key theory suggests two main ancestral groups contributing to the population.
Two groups.
Yeah. First, the southern ancient Mongoloids, who are seen as the direct ancestors of the Jomon people we'll get to. And second, the northern New Mongoloids, thought to have arrived later, mostly settling in western Japan during the Yayoi and Kofun periods.
So not just one migration, but different waves, different groups mixing over time.
That's the current thinking, yes. The intermingling of these groups is believed to have formed the main Japanese population, the Wajin.
Interesting.
And it's thought that some groups, like the Ainu and Hokkaido and the Ryukyu people in the Southwest Islands, might retain more physical traits linked to that earlier ancient Mongoloid lineage.
Okay, that sets the stage for the next major shift, the Jomon period. What changes mark the beginning of this era?
Well, that shift into the Holocene epoch brought huge environmental changes. The climate got much warmer, glaciers retreated.
And the animals change.
Yes, the big Ice Age megafauna gradually disappeared, replaced by smaller animals like deer, wild boar, rabbits. And the landscape itself changed. Forests expanded, more lakes and rivers formed. A richer environment in many ways.
And it's in this new environment that we see pottery appear.
Exactly. Pottery is the defining characteristic, the hallmark of the Jomon period. And some of the earliest pottery found in Japan dates back around 12,000 years.
12,000 years. That's incredibly old. Some of the oldest in the world, isn't it?
It is. Jomon pottery is very distinctive, lots of different shapes, but often famous for its cord-marked patterns. That's what Jomon actually means, cord-marked.
Oh, okay.
It was generally fired at low temperatures, so it tends to be quite thick, blackish brown or reddish brown, and, well, relatively fragile compared to later pottery.
And having pottery puts the Jomon period into the Neolithic Age, or New Stone Age in archaeological terms.
Correct. That, along with other tool advancements. It wasn't just pottery. We also see more use of polished stone tools, things like stone axes for cutting wood, chisels, grinding stones maybe for processing nuts and plants.
So improvements in stone tools, too. What else?
Bows and arrows become important. Much better for hunting those smaller, faster animals that were now common. And they also made tools from bone and antler fishhooks. Harpoons showing they were really utilizing rivers and coasts, too.
These new technologies must have really changed daily life. We often hear about shell mounds from the Jomon period. What do those tell us?
Shell mounds, or kaizuka, are fascinating. They're basically ancient garbage dumps, Most discarded shells, but also animal bones, broken pottery, old tools.
A treasure trove for archaeologists.
Definitely. By carefully excavating them, we can learn a huge amount about diet, activities, even the seasons. For example, looking at the growth lines in the shells can tell us when they were harvested.
And what does that show?
It suggests shellfish gathering was really big in spring and early summer, probably when they were most abundant or easiest to collect.
Makes sense. What about other activities? Can the mounds tell us about those too?
Yeah, there's evidence suggesting pottery making might have been more common in autumn and winter. We find clay residues, specific wear patterns on shells from those seasons' layers.
And even imprints of mature autumn leaves on the bottom of some pots.
Wow, that's specific. What about hunting?
Hunting seems to peak in winter. We find male deer skulls with antlers still attached, meaning they were hunted before the antlers shed naturally in spring.
Okay.
Plus, animals have thicker fur and more fat in winter, making them more valuable. And, with leaves off the trees and deciduous forests, spotting game would be easier.
So their whole year was really structured around these natural cycles.
Absolutely. Deeply dependent on and in tune with the environment.
Where did they actually live? What were their settlements like?
Typically, Jomon people lived in pit dwellings, Tatiana Juco. These were dug partially into the ground, usually on the edges of plateaus near a source of fresh spring water.
Practical location.
Right, they'd have a central hearth inside for warmth and cooking. Studies suggest maybe 4 or 5 people lived in an average dwelling, and they often had storage pits dug near the hearth, probably for keeping nuts like chestnuts, acorns, horse chestnuts.
And how big were these villages? Most seem quite small, maybe 4 to 6 dwellings at any one time. But some major sites show traces of over 100 dwelling pits.
100, so people lived there for a long time.
It implies that, yes, the same spots were used, rebuilt, lived in over many generations, suggesting they weren't purely nomadic, perhaps more semi-sedentary. The shell mounds themselves are often found near these settlements, sometimes in horseshoe or ring shapes, close to the dwellings and the forests they relied on.
We also find those distinctive figurines, the dogu, and evidence of strange customs like tooth pulling. What's the thinking behind those?
The dogu figurines are really intriguing. Often female forms, especially later in the Jolman. They're generally thought to have had ritual or symbolic meaning, maybe related to fertility, praying for successful hunts or plant gathering, perhaps healing.
And pulling teeth.
Tooth extraction, yeah. It seems to have been practiced possibly as a rite of passage, marking the transition to adulthood or group identity. And their burials were distinctive too, usually flexed burial, kuso, where the body is arranged in a fetal position.
So what do archaeologists make of all these customs? The figurines, tooth pulling, burial style?
Well, living as hunter-gatherers, even in a relatively rich environment, involved uncertainties. Bad weather, unpredictable game, illness.
Sure.
So these practices likely reflect attempts to manage that uncertainty, maybe fostering social cohesion, expressing a reverence for and perhaps fear of natural forces, and enacting prayers or rituals for fertility and abundance, a way of making sense of their world.
It paints a picture of a rich spiritual and social life alongside the practicalities of survival. What about language? Do we know anything about the roots of the Japanese language from this far back?
Language origins are incredibly tricky to trace that far back, and it's still debated. But one prominent idea is that the grammar of Japanese might have links to the Altaic language family found across northern Asia.
Okay.
But interestingly, the sounds, the phonology, and a lot of the basic vocabulary seem to show more southern connections.
So maybe a mix, like the population origins?
It could point that way, yes. A complex picture, likely involving mixing over long periods.
Can archaeology tell us anything about what a Jom family might have looked like?
Sometimes we get glimpses. There's a really compelling, if slightly grim, example from the Ubayama shell mound in Chiba Prefecture.
What was found there?
Inside a pit dwelling from the mid-Jomon period, they found the skeletons of 5 people, all overlapping.
5 people together. Not a normal burial.
Doesn't look like it.
Mm.
The remains were 2 adult males, 1 adult female, a child, and an older woman, slightly separate from the main group.
What happened to them?
One theory, because they weren't formally buried, is that they might have died around the same time. Perhaps accidentally, like from eating poisonous pufferfish, which are found in the region. Maybe the survivors were too afraid to handle the bodies properly afterwards.
That's quite a scenario, but what does it suggest about family?
Well, the combination of individuals, 2 men, 2 women at different ages, a child led researchers to hypothesize this could have been a small, multi-generational family unit living together. Perhaps a couple, their child, and maybe one of their mothers or another relative.
A rare snapshot, potentially, of a Jomon household.
Exactly. A poignant glimpse into their possible living arrangements and the close-knit nature of their groups.
So this whole Jomon period, the unique pottery, adapting to the new environment, the shell mounds, the dwellings, the rituals, it really formed the bedrock, didn't it?
Absolutely. The Jomon culture wasn't brief. It thrived for thousands of years. It represents this incredibly long period of innovation and the development of a distinct way of life deeply tied to the Japanese islands. It's a fundamental layer of Japanese ethnicity and culture.
All before the next big changes came along.
Right, before things like widespread rice cultivation and metalworking arrived from the continent, which marks the beginning of the Yayoi period, around the 4th century BCE.
Yeah.
So when you pull it all together, the story of Japan's earliest inhabitants is, well, it's long, it's complex, it's full of adaptation, ingenuity, people responding to a world that was constantly changing around them. From those land bridges allowing the first arrivals, to figuring out stone tools, to inventing some of the world's earliest pottery. These periods really did lay the essential groundwork for everything that followed.
Okay, let's just pause and think about that. What really jumps out at you from these incredibly early chapters? Is it the sheer resilience, people adapting to ice ages and then warming periods?
That's definitely part of it.
Or is it the ingenuity, taking stone and making precisely what they needed? Or maybe those little glimpses into their social world, the burials, the figurines, that family at Ubayama. It really makes you appreciate the depth of human experience right here in these islands from the very beginning.
And it prompts a bigger question, doesn't it? How does knowing about these ancient connections to the continent, to the specific environment of Japan, how might that help us interpret what happened later in Japanese history and culture?
That's where it gets really interesting. Thinking about how the skills the Jomon people honed over millennia, their detailed knowledge of plants, animals, seasons, how might that have influenced the way later societies, even much later ones, interacted with this specific Japanese landscape? Did it leave a subtle imprint?
And looking forward, while we've learned so much, archaeology is always uncovering more. You have to wonder what future discoveries might tell us. What new finds could suddenly shine a brighter light on how these early people lived, what they believed.
So for you listening, as you continue exploring Japanese history, what does this all mean? It means remembering that beneath the well-known eras of samurai and shoguns, there's this incredibly deep, fascinating story.
Yeah, a story of human adaptation, of innovation against the odds, and this profound, long-standing connection between people and the land they inhabit.
We really hope this deep dive into Japan's earliest chapters has sparked your curiosity and makes you want to dig even deeper into these beginnings.